Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again from Film Fanatic headquarters. Hope everyone's doing good. It is Wednesday. Yeah, it's hard to believe it's Wednesday already. It is about 9:43. Hope everyone's doing good. So yeah, I appreciate there's been some new folks coming on board and some lots of new people commenting on the videos, and so, and that's, to me, that's pretty fabulous. I love interacting with other people who are other film fanatics, if you will. It's always a blast. It's a super fun aspect of this channel. Kind of the most I almost get the most enjoyment out of coming across people who have some of the strange taste that I have, and I'm always surprised by certain films that get a certain reaction from people. So I really appreciate that. I really appreciate the support. So forever onward and forward we will go. So today is a show on. Well, today's another specialty show. I like to do shows that are tied to music. I've done some specialty shows on music that really is an integral part for how my brain works, and music that is just, you know, uh, certain bands or certain styles that are just like really, really influential for me. I did a couple of shows. I've done two shows on my favorite electronic group of all time, and that is Alltecker. I did a show where I just talked about them as a band, and they are, hands down my favorite group of all time. I can listen to them. Certain groups and certain bands or songs for that matter, you have to, you might be in a certain kind of mood to maybe throw it in. But there's certain groups where Alltecker being the best example, where I can just kind of throw in their music, anytime. And I own most of their albums. There's still a few I need to get. I've heard all of them, and I have most of them. And they're, for me, my music, musically, or just being a fan of music, but then also for the music that I write for my band Quantum, they are without a doubt, the biggest influence, the biggest inspiration. So I did a big show just on them, and then I did a show on my favorite collection of music that they put out. So that was a lot of fun. So I've done a couple of shows on them, and I've talked about them a lot in a lot of other videos. Especially, with Quantum, my band Quantum. It's the main thing that kind of influences that band and my writing is definitely the film going experience, movies, just movies in general, everything from soundtracks to aesthetics to pacing. One thing I've often talked about with like how our music is, a lot of the times, like for instance, a lot of the times our music or our sets were in the 3 hour range, and we kind of got used to, although it's like at first getting to that place to where you could cover 3 hours of music, it's kind of daunting and obviously very intimidating, especially if you're doing all original music, because that's a lot of music for anybody to listen to. But then it's also, requires a lot of work, it requires a lot of material. But when we started to do more shows that were lengthy like that, I started to get into that thing of trying to pace things, trying to build things, and I really, for me, that was a real integral part for my kind of development, or and to try to figure out how to solve that riddle, that puzzle. And I got, so what had happened was there were a whole slew of films that I really start paying attention to. And the main thing that I was really paying attention to was like the pacing. I typically like films that are on the slower side, and that where there's like this slow build up, a slow burn, if you will, of a process. And I really got into that whole that whole kind of mindset. And so that's what I started to do with quantum. That became a big part, or really the main part, and something that I took a value from the, for instance, in a film, the arc of a character, or the situation that a group of characters are in, the attention to detail, the giving, maybe giving information but not really saying all that much. And I have found like directors and films that I really love, you're kind of in the palm of their hand by say 10 or 15 minutes into it. You're kind of mesmerized by what's going on. You start caring about the characters, and it just has an atmosphere. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have like, 1,000 lines of dialogue thrown at you every minute, or that you need to have explosions going off all the time. A really great example for me with that would be, for film, would be Ridley Scott's Alien from 1979. For all intents and purposes, a very slow film, but you're getting all of this information. So that's what I had taken from my love of films, and started to use that when I would put together the music. Even in the actual writing process. So speaking of quantum, we're going to be playing a big show this Friday night at Hot Hill Tavern in Thomaston, Maine, with my friend's band Over, which is a really killer band, very exciting. They're a power trio. They're all original. They have such a, I don't know, a really unique sound. They have this kind of quirky, slightly strange, kind of whimsical prog rock kind of sound. They're hard to describe, and they definitely have like a metal sound. They're a power trio. They're pretty loud. They're totally rocking, and it's all original music. Very cool band. I've seen them play a few times. I actually went to their first gig. There are a couple of my good friends are in that band, and I've been really trying to support them. But they're a pretty awesome band. They're kind of my favorite new local band that's kind of emerged, out of nowhere. But they're not like anything else in any way, shape, or form. So very cool. I'm very kind of honored that they asked us to play with Quantum. So we're going to be playing. I think they're going to be playing like an hour and a half to 2 hour set, and then we're going to be playing, opening up for them, and we're going to be playing and 1 hour of music. So come on by. It starts at 7 o'clock. It's this Friday night, and it's at the Hot Hill Tavern down to Thomaston, Maine. So looking forward to it. And there'll be some more shows, working on some new things and some other things with Quantum, as far as other events. So this brings me to one of my favorite bands, and for me, one of the biggest sources of inspiration, and that is the one and only Suicide. Just an amazing electronic duo that were, almost 50 years ahead of their time. The scope and range that this band, you know, kind of encapsulated, and the amount of artists that they have inspired, and when you think about how timeless their whole the way they created music and the content and all of the things that they kind of accomplished, when you see where they came from, what they became, it's it's one of the most like inspiring tales, involving music, I think, ever in a lot of ways. Suicide was a band that was is like one of the most underground bands for so long in the 70s. They were a pretty prolific band from the 70s to all the way into like the early mid 2000s, but their heyday was in the 70s. They were a they were a band that consisted of Alan Vega and Martin Rev. It was a duo. And again, electronic music is my favorite style of music. These guys were, you know, putting out records in the 70s. Their first album was released in 1977. I was just listening to it this morning, and again, it's just wild, like how it sounds. When I listen to their music, it sounds like it came out in 2023. I mean, talk about futurist music, where it speaks to a degree like languages and dialects that haven't even really been invented. That's a way that's a way of how I think about how deep their actual music is. The way I discovered Suicide, it was real interesting because they were a part of this whole scene in New York in the 70s that was called the no wave sound, where basically it was, more or less a punk rock scene. Probably about 13 or 14 years ago, I'd seen a documentary, and this was going back. So my girlfriend at the time had subscribed to this new thing that was called Netflix. And it was when Netflix had first come out, and the way they operated was you would go to you'd go to their website. I think some of these things still exist, or how they do things, but you would go basically to their website, and you would go to their this thing that was called like the queue, and they'd have their titles listed, and they'd have different genres of films. They had tons of documentaries. At that time, I was watching tons of documentaries. I still really, really love documentaries. I haven't really been up on them like I used to, but I used to watch them religiously. And I remember that was one of the things that really stood out by checking out some of the films that they had, was that they had all of these documentaries, a lot of amazing music documentaries that I had never heard of before. So, and a lot of obscure things. So I remember coming across this one movie that they had that was about this whole like no wave sound, or this whole like no wave movement that was happening in New York. And back then, when you got a movie from Netflix, this is way before the whole streaming platform. Basically, what you would do, you would go onto the site, go through the queue. It would be like you would be in a checkout aisle at a store, and you would find a movie that you would like, and you would just kind of click on it and check on it, and then you would pay like your monthly fee or whatnot, and then they would send it to you, an actual physical disc. And it was a funny thing because you could only order, I think you could only order like a couple of movies at a time. You couldn't like, you know get crazy and like order five movies. You could only order one or two, and then it would actually be sent in the mail to you, and it would come on this disc, and it would come in this little like packaging, and then you have a physical disc, and it would be a DVD. This was before Blu-rays. Like, it's funny how archaic this whole thing sounds. And then you would watch the movie, and then when you were done, the cool thing about it, or the allure of doing it this way, essentially renting movies this way, was that, if you got the movie, there was no time that it needed to be back. You could watch it at your leisure. There was no like, oh, you only have 2 days to watch it or whatever. So you could watch it any time, and you could hold on to it. And so that was a big allure of it, where video places, video shops, chains, you have a set day of when a movie has to be returned. So, and and it was you know, a funny thing. And the the movies would be shipped. Netflix, I think they still have it, but Netflix had their distribution company, or one of their distribution companies here, right in Portland, Maine. And watching this documentary, I was blown away. It was not only music that I really loved, and it was new, and I was always a big fan of punk rock music. I was always attracted to kind of underground music as a kid. I grew up. My whole kind of trajectory of music was Kiss, being probably my first band, and then I got into, you know, Ozzy Osbourne, and then I got into, that led me into Black Sabbath, and then that got me into like Metallica, and then eventually I got into Slayer. I started to have a craving for music that was darker, more extreme. And right around that time that I started getting into like heavier music and more extreme music, I was also exposed to a lot of the hardcore music that was coming out. I grew up at the tail end of the punk scene. I was into a lot of the hardcore bands, and then I was also into some of the more harsh, kind of extreme punk bands. So, and then I also really got into some early hip hop that was coming out at the time, and electronic music. Depeche Mode being the very first band I ever heard that played electronic music. So, I was kind of always into all of those things, but I was really attracted to the whole punk scene because I loved the thing almost even more so than the actual music. I was a big fan of the music, but the thing that I loved about it, and it also applied to a lot of the metal bands that I was into, was the kind of the work ethic of where you have these artists and these bands that are, you know, playing for a smaller group, playing for a group of people, a more underground scene, music that wasn't backed commercially. And the thing that I always loved about that was how do it yourself was the kind of the mode of operation of where a lot of these groups and bands, especially in the punk scene, but they didn't have any financial backing from anything or anyone. They were, at the end of the day, they were just really passionate for what they were doing in their craft, and it was like a real reactionary, emotional, cathartic experience and project, and they connected, and the music resonated with people who felt the same way, people who felt isolated, people who felt they were part of the downtrodden. They were just the society's outcasts. So it just and but the work ethic part of it was so cool and inspiring, of where you had these groups of musicians who essentially were poor and had nothing, and they were able to, just through hard work and using what talents they had, to kind of cultivate this scene to where it became eventually this kind of phenomenon, and it became this thing that was larger than life, to where now it's even it's gone on to influence so many styles and so many bands, and it evolved to this giant movement. And so the whole, like, when I first saw this documentary, it was talking about this whole no wave sound, and basically what the whole no wave sound was, and it took place like in the early '70s, and it was like a reactionary music that came out of a lot of the more pop based rock or dance music that was coming out at the time. And you had all of these bands that came out in New York in the '70s. Suicide, which is what today's show is on about. There were other artists that were called Lydia Lunch was another really big figure in that scene. There was DNA was another fantastic band. There was a whole slew of all of these bands. And it's interesting because the way I came across, the way I found it, the way I, heard about this documentary and this whole scene was I had watched a interview, and this was going back years ago. I had watched an interview with Thurston Moore from one of the founding members of Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth was a huge band for my, in my youth. I still love them. I got into their music, kind of right when I was getting into metal. And I remember seeing an interview with, or yeah, seeing an interview with Thurston Moore, and he was, I was always curious because they had such a unique sound as a band, as a rock band. They had this very heavy use of dissonance and aggression, but it was a different kind of aggression than say the metal, world. But it just had this real edgy, kind of dangerous vibe, but they would use a lot of dissonance in their music. So I was always like, wow, how did they develop that sound? Where did that come from? What were they listening to? And I remember seeing an interview with Thurston Moore, and he talked all about these very same bands, Lydia Lunch and DNA and Suicide, and he said that this was music that he grew up listening to, and this was what helped develop their sound. So that was like, wow, okay, because I'm a firm believer, and I've talked about it before, where if you're into a certain band, um, you know, or a certain genre of music, what I typically do is you know, for instance, Autechre, what I've done with that group is I'll try to seek out what influenced them, what was their thing that got them motivated to get out of bed every morning, and then I'll go and check out that music. So we'll open up this whole big, you know, endless areas, all these endless areas of exposure to all of this other music and art. So I always groups that I've always looked up to and that I really admire, I would always, try to check out what how their brain worked, what influenced them, and I do the same thing for filmmakers. A lot of filmmakers that I love, I will try to seek out interviews with them or what have you, and see what influences them. And it's such a cool process. And so that's how through this Thurston Moore interview, this was how I discovered this documentary. And I remember watching it, and I was just blown away by what this movie had presented. And I became enamored with the band, and especially Suicide, because electronic music is my favorite style. And I was amazed that these guys were doing music, almost 50 years ago. And when you hear the stories and the tales, and you see interviews with these guys of what they went through, I think at the core of their band, of what these guys created, was definitely a punk kind of aesthetic in the punk scene. I mean, you talk about, people who were pretty much homeless and had nothing. These guys were virtually living on the streets, and they had nothing. They absolutely nothing. No one or nothing took what they did seriously, but they just really believed that they had their own sense of style, their own voice, and they just believed into it. It believed into it so much that it manifested into, what they became. And there are all these like notorious stories of where they would play a lot of shows. I have a couple of live albums of theirs, and you can they had a relatively pretty big amount of success. They ended up touring and opening up for some fairly big bands, and I believe like some of the bands they ended up opening up for were like the Clash and Iggy Pop and the Stooges and a few other big bands, and you can hear on some of their recordings, because their music was very, very harsh and really aggressive. It also was incredibly beautiful and always had this sense of melody. But their music was also very, very confrontational. And you can hear in a lot of recordings of where they were opening up for like really well-known bands of the audience like booing them and kind of attacking them and just being outraged because they pushed all these buttons. And they were like definitely a group that has had that, very confrontational, super aggressive, in your face, kind of aesthetic. But it's interesting because whenever I listen to their music, and I've listened to their music so much, but there's been gaps of time of where I I haven't listened to them for a while, and I revisit their stuff, and I'm always amazed by how, along with the music being incredibly harsh and aggressive and super dark and very confrontational, their music is also really beautiful and optimistic and very inspiring. That's and I've seen and read lots of interviews with Alan Vega and Martin Rev, and they said that, lots of interviews where they said that the, kind of the exterior of the band was, very dark, very confrontational, but they said that at the core of what they were kind of doing as a band, as a duo, it was actually very, very, like, they really were kind of all about sharing this positive view and trying to give people hope and giving people a sense of self worth that you know life is beautiful. Art is important. The feeling that art gives people, and that, if you more or less work really hard and you're in tune with your creativity, you can do anything. So at the core, like, it's an interesting, and I feel like Suicide's all about juxtaposition as a band. I love when groups have a real multifaceted kind of aesthetic, or that whole juxtaposition thing of, if you listen to a group and they take you on this emotional journey, and it has this dynamic range. There's a it can take you through, the whole gamut of human emotions. I love when music really does that, and I gravitate towards music that kind of creates that feeling more than other styles of music. There are there's definitely, other groups. There's, like, if you listen to a specific hip hop group, or a specific metal band, or maybe a specific jazz trio, or quintet, or a specific pop song, or a specific artist for that matter, you kind of get the emotion that, it might make you feel happy, it might make you feel sad, or it might make you want to throw a party. But it has a very specific thing, and maybe that group or that project or that artist is kind of focused on creating that same kind of feeling or that vibe. But for me, I love music that where it can bring you into all different kinds of directions. Artists for me that do that is the Miles Davis Quintet. I did a big show on them. I mean, Miles Davis is one of my, all-time favorites and one of my biggest inspirations. But I think particularly around the Miles Davis quintet, his later quintet that he had, the gamut of different emotional threads that they would tie together was unlike anything else. That's pretty much the main reason why Autechre is my favorite electronic group, because it's all instrumental music, but it has it for me. It takes me through every emotional uh, feeling or color that I can imagine. It's not one dimensional. It's not. I'm not gonna just throw on some Autechre if I'm feeling like, really happy, or if I'm just like in, say, a party mode. I they can touch on everything, everything for me emotionally. And it's also very cinematic. And I feel like Suicide very much has that sound of where it can take you in so many different emotional places. And specifically in regards to Suicide, when you think about when this music came out, you know, in the 70s, mid to late 70s, especially with their first album that came out in 1977, which I think is their best, definitely their best album. Their other stuff is really great too, but there's something really magical about the first album. Essentially, when you think of the instrumentation, it's essentially someone singing on vocals and someone playing keyboards, and that's literally it. And Alan Vega was the singer and vocalist, and Martin Rev was the keyboard player. And when you think of like technology back then, on how almost beyond primitive, in comparison to say today's standards, they, I mean, you talk about utilizing your particular equipment at a given time. And the thing that I'm always amazed by, like listening to their music, especially their studio albums, I live they were really ferocious, and kind of these they always came whenever I listen to like live recordings of them. They always feel it always felt like you were listening to these like caged animals, because the music is so raw. And but their studio stuff, the thing that's so staggering about their studio stuff is how pristine it sounds and how beautiful it sounds. And when you think about, nowadays, if you're a fan of electronic music, I mean, there's literally a billion options that of different ways of creating music now. Like you can, I have a friend who has been experimenting and working on electronic music, and she's using these various apps that she's able to get on her phone. And she has this one particular app that is actually really, really good. The sound quality is really, really great, and it's got all of these interesting presets, different drum machines to choose from and keyboard sounds. But from a production standpoint, and just this overall sound, it's kind of sounds incredible. Like it's unbelievable, and she's able to do these things and has access to this technology through her phone. And she's creating music, and she's kind of developing a sound and developing a skill set. And so it's astounding what a person can do, but also all of those options and choices with all of the different software that you have, the bazillion different brands of keyboards and drum machines. A lot nowadays, a lot of older keyboards and drum machines are kind of considered the boutique. They hip and cool. They're very hip and cool. So a lot of their value for a lot of these old keyboards and drum machines at one point that were like kind of considered to be just kind of junky. Now it's like, and also lots of effects pedals. At one point they were just kind of considered junky and kind of throwaway. But in this day and age, people are like doing whatever they can to kind of like bring that sound back. And so, a lot of these vintage keyboards and drum machines are worth, you know, two or three times the price that they were. And so that's kind of like gone back. There's always this full circle kind of aspect to music and art where people will always, certain things will always come back. A lot of things will just, over time, if they don't really, resonate with people or they don't have the attention of the public, they obviously things will just kind of fade away and they might be trendy and they just kind of, fall by the wayside. But there are certain aspects in every decade, especially in regards to what I'm talking about with music, whether it's like, a particular sound that people have, there will be, people will, it will come back at some point. People really, I think overall people in music are really enamored and fascinated and kind of obsessed with how things were done in the 70s. I feel that I feel that's the same kind of the same thing for movies. You know that that whole that whole thing kind of just comes back. Um, Newer directors referencing older films from the 70s are, trying to figure out how they developed a certain technique. Maybe it's something taken from a film from like mid to late 70s, and it could be, say related to the cinematography or the pacing or the score or practical effects versus, CGI. So that stuff always comes back, and I feel like that's permeated our culture. That's always going to be a cherished decade. So, and then I see that with music too, especially now where you have all of these groups that are trying to kind of emulate all this great art and stuff that came out in the 70s. And it's the same thing. Whether a person will track down this like really obscure vintage, keyboard or drum machine or pedals, effects pedals, and which will kind of create that vibe or that sound of transporting you back into the classic decade of the 70s. And another big thing too, I think, is recording. Like recording, things have moved so far in advance as far as like Pro Tools and where everything is really quantized and digital. But I've seen a recent trend in a lot of areas of where a lot of musicians are wanting to go for that more raw sound, that more unfiltered sound of where it sounds, more and more live. So that I feel like that's going to come back around, and it already has come, it's come around for the third or fourth time, full circle. And I feel like Suicide was the epitome of that. Their music was so incredibly raw, and I think that they were purveyors and probably not conscious of it at the time, but I'm a big firm believer in the whole kind of idea of less is more. And they had nothing. They had this skimpy little keyboard with some processors, some effects, and then it had presets, and that was it. Like no equipment compared to today's standards. That's one thing I notice now. Like if I see a band play now, it can be a rock band or it can be any band. It seems like even though technology is making things easier to a degree for a lot of musicians, and to where you don't necessarily have to, it's at a point now where guitar players don't even have to really necessarily bring an amp to a gig anymore. But I've seen what I've seen, which is interesting, is the amount of gear that your average band uses is kind of staggering. Like that's one thing I noticed is that people are really trying to explore different textures and being influenced by lots of things, and they're incorporating all kinds of pedals and effects. Like it's very rare to see a band these days that does not have that where each member in the band has this huge pedal board where they have all of these effects. And going back to what I'm talking about, Suicide in that decade, a lot of that stuff, sound wise or color wise, is from that decade. So it more and more, I think, and it's great and fantastic, but I see now like most groups have so much gear, where you would think that technology would lessen that load of that kind of a thing, but it seems like people are just gravitating to buying and getting more and more gear. I notice even within the groups that I play in, for the most part, there's a lot of gear and there's a lot of stuff on stage. And when I think about the decade of the 70s and what Suicide was doing, creating so much sound, so much rich art with nothing, a keyboard and a microphone. Like to me, it's staggering. And using these little cheap little kind of processors for putting effects on the keyboards, like a delay basically using a really kind of shoddy reverb pedal or a delay pedal for the vocals or for the keyboard sound or for the drum machine. But if you look at it for face value, like there's virtually no gear that's being used. And I love how they were able to get so much sound out of so little. Like, it's amazing. And the thing is like the gear that they did use, they knew so well, like the back of their hand. And the depth of their music is just incredible because of that, you know? I mean, for me, and I'm not at all equating myself because I never feel like we'll ever be on par with what Suicide has done. But it's a big inspiration. Where like with that is another big thing that I've taken from my love of Suicide as far as my influence on my band Quantum is the idea of less is more. I think overall that word can be used, or that saying can be used to for almost everything. It could be just you can use it socially, but then when it comes to music and especially recording, I think having some control and restraint. I think the when an artist I think sometimes have has a good sense of control and restraint, they can actually say more than if they had say everything in the kitchen sink, at your disposal. There's something to be said about that, and I understand that it depends on the situation, but I kind of gravitate towards that less is more attitude. And so another major influence that I've taken from Suicide is how that like I said, they speak like just volumes, but they're not really using much at all to communicate those ideas. So with my band Quantum, the thing that I've taken from that directly is I don't really use very much gear at all for that band, and I just I don't know, it kind of just happened naturally. It was a long process, but in a lot lots of experimentation. But essentially, again, at face value, I really don't use very much equipment. I basically use a drum machine, a keyboard, and a vocal mic. That's really it. Granted, the drum machine that I have has tons of capabilities, but at the core of it, it's it's kind of simple Simon. I mean, it's super stripped down, you know. And we had a gig a couple weeks ago with Quantum, and I had a friend that came to the show, and he had never really seen us play before, and he seemed to really like it, and he wanted me to show him what I use. So after we got done playing and we were talking for a little bit, I took him on stage and just showed him the gear, and I said, "Yeah, it's just I don't use." It kind of happened naturally that way, but I'm kind of arrived to a point of where I don't really want to have to incorporate more gear. I kind of want to just. I feel like the stuff I have here, it's unlimited to what you can do or say with the music, with these pieces of equipment, and I don't really want to incorporate other equipment. I want to try to focus, and because I'm always learning with this stuff all the time, and so he seems surprised that I don't have very much gear, and that's the whole thing. Like where I, you know, try to maximize as much as I can with very little, and so that idea, that kind of work ethic, is directly inspired by Suicide, by how they just spoke volumes with virtually no tools, you know. And when I see lots of electronic artists now, like they have these really massive setups, multiple drum machines, a computer, and that's fine because it can create that sound that they want. But I like I like it when you can see somebody just with the bare bones and they can, say a lot and do a lot. And again, Suicide is the biggest inspiration as far as that goes, and not only their music, and it's interesting because again I've talked about the juxtaposition and how I really love juxtaposition. Film wise, I think one of the biggest purveyors of juxtaposition is David Lynch, where you have this juxtaposition of horror, darkness, and beauty and light and hope, all intertwined with each other, you know, simultaneously in the art. And I really, really love that. I also feel another artist that is tremendously all about that was David Bowie. Just very ambiguous, and the music could mean so many different things, expressing the gamut of all of these emotions. And so, Autechre, Suicide, David Bowie, those groups, Miles Davis Quintet, I would have to say at face value, those groups are the biggest influence for me artistically. And I naturally, gravitate towards music like that because of that feeling. And, and Suicide is, such an integral, important part of the band, of what I love and what inspires me. And I they have gotten lots of acclaim over the years, and it took a very long time. Most notably, Bruce Springsteen. He's actually covered some of their songs, which is wild. And they became really good friends later in life with Bruce Springsteen. He actually recorded some of their songs and has said that they were such a big influence on him at one point in his career, which is wild. But I still come across a lot of people who have never heard of Suicide. It's interesting. They definitely have gotten their just awards, over the years, and they definitely established this huge legacy. But it took a very, very long time. But still, very much underground. And every now and then it will come up where I'll tell somebody. I've had two friends of where I had mentioned because I knew where I kind of got a sense of their taste and they're into like lots of cool music. So I figured they'll probably really love Suicide, and I think it's an essential band to listen to. And a couple of times I've turned on a couple of friends to Suicide, and they were like blown away. They were like, "Wow, how did I miss this? Like, this is amazing." And again, that's how their music is and was and will always be for me. Just some of the most incredible electronic music, some of the most pioneering music ever created, so ahead of its time. And the biggest thing for me is the juxtaposition. Their music is at times horrific, incredibly confrontational, scary, incredibly dark and brooding, but then it's also gorgeous, wholesome, beautiful, innocent. Yeah, so it's that whole. You can't really pin them down that way. You can't you can't you can't look at them in a narrow scope and say, well, this is what they are because they had all of this juxtaposition in their sound. And to me, that's really the beauty of them, and amazing. So I highly recommend. They're one of the greatest groups ever, and when it comes to electronic music, one of the most pioneering artists, if not the most. When I think of other electronic music, I kind of feel like they might be the most pioneering figures in electronic music. There was music that came out before that, but I don't know. I don't know if anything else has had the impact that Suicide really, the far-reaching impact that they have had in their careers. So, this is Jason Dean. Thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.